This video is about a bug I discovered recently in the ASP.NET.Cors library. If you don't know what the same origin policy is and are not generally interested in web security, you can skip this video. But if you are remotely interested in security, especially web security, and you know what the same origin policy is, and if you've kind of used it somewhere, either at the client side or writing server-side code using any framework, you will definitely be interested in what I'm going to say here. I'm not going to explain what same origin is and what Cors is. I assume you already know all of that. If you don't, please go and read some elementary stuff. I'll create an API. I'll call it API. I'll call the project API, just API. And I'm going to get rid of all the needless stuff. I'm going to start from scratch. I'll create just a test controller. That's going to be an API controller. And I'll call it test. And that's just going to have one method. Let's assume that this method has some important business logic for your application. Something that matters. In other words, this method is not idempotent. In still other words, calling this method again and again is not okay. Every time you call this method, something important is going to happen. Maybe a new customer is going to be created. Maybe a new financial transaction is going to happen. Maybe a new entry is going to be logged. Something important that you don't want callously happening when someone accidentally calls this method more than once. I read the file, I increment the number, I write back the new number, and I return the number as a string. Let me put all of this in a try-catch block just in case we have errors, like if the file doesn't exist or something else. Don't panic, we don't have a home page yet, and that's why you're seeing this. Our API is running. To test it, I'll call this controller. Of course, it's not a get. Let me change it to a get momentarily just to test that the API is running. Okay. Lovely. I'll change it back to the post because I intend to call this from a website that I'll make now. I'll create a folder here called website, in which I'm going to create just a simple HTML page that makes a post request to the API. I'll add a reference to the jQuery library and a script we will write. I have a heading. I intend to show the counter here and a button. When this button is clicked, I intend to show the actual counter value over here in this H2. Let's write the script to do that. That's about it. Let me fix the port, run the API. That's 49912. Everything looks fine, so let me just run this. I've got this set up on a server at port 8088. So I'll just run that. And we have our page. I clicked get counter, but I got an error. Now that's because of the same origin policy. You know that every browser will prevent any script to make a request to a domain that's different from the domain from where the script was downloaded. And that's why we had this error. To cross-check that, go to the developer tools and look at the console. And you'll see the message. But the message simply says that the API disallows any requests from this domain. It doesn't know who this domain is. Now you would think this is fantastic. What a security check. The browser is so great, it did this thing for me. It actually didn't do a damn thing. Let me show you what's happening actually under the covers. Let's go back to the website and make another request for this. It says it blocked it, but did it actually block it? Let's go to the file and check the value. If the value is still 5, then the request did not make it to the API. But the value is 6. What happened? The request came to the API. The browser simply is showing you a facade. To cross-check that, look at the network tab. It actually did make a post request to the URL /test, and it got a result of 200, which means it said, the browser said everything is okay. The API said everything is okay. You're super. I love you. Let me help you make the request. And it sent it the response 6. You want to cross-check that again? Let's set a breakpoint in the API. Go to the controller. I'll set a breakpoint over here. I'll go back here. I'll press this button. And you see that the request did make it to the API, and the API executed everything without errors. So what you're seeing here is not really any kind of prevention. It's just telling you, the browser is telling you a bunch of lies. It's saying you can't call this API, but actually, as you can see, as we saw in the debugger, and we also saw here in the network tools, it actually does call the API. And what that means is that's a security issue that you should be very worried about, because it means that either you make all the API methods idempotent, which is a joke, of course. You can't, which means that you have to write methods that actually don't do anything. Now your API does do something. It's not a read-only API, which means someone could be calling your API. If you don't know anything about same origin policy, or if you know something and you see this message and you're saying you're super happy and you're saying, wow, the browser takes care of everything, so sweet, you are deluded. This API is being called, which means your customers are being created, or fake orders are being generated, or fake transactions are being done while you sleep and you don't know anything about it. So first thing is to know about the same origin policy, and then the second thing is to know that you have to do something about it. It's not something that comes out of the box. It's just the browser telling you, it's covering a facade. What the browser is doing is it is making a request to the API, but not making it's also getting the result from the API, but it's at this time, after it gets the result, it makes this result unavailable to your script. So your script in the debugger will not land here in the success function. It'll land here in the error function, which is also why you're seeing this error text. To demonstrate that, let's click this button again. It hits the API, it does everything correctly. It goes to the okay, yeah, everything is superb. The API says, let me create this new customer for you. Let me create this new order for you. And screw with your business. Some hacker might have an open hole into your server. If you don't know anything about same origin policy and this is what you've done, then you probably don't know that you've exposed a vulnerability of your business. And you could be happily unaware of it, and your client side also reports happy, everything is superb. We get an error, nobody can call this message, nobody can call your API, you're super strong, super secure, but in fact you're not. Your API is being called left, right, center. So that's the basic premise. I'm still not on the point of the error in the Cors lib. I'm getting to that. This is the default behavior. Now, to mitigate against this behavior, you obviously need some kind of protection on the API side to restrict. Maybe you want to restrict a set of domains. You want to whitelist a set of domains from which script XHR calls can be made, and that's the whole point of those Cors headers, or those same origin policy headers, the exchange of those headers between the client and the server. Now I'm not going to talk about what those are, what those headers are, and what's a pre-flight request and what's an options method, but I'm assuming you already know all of that. I'm going to talk about an implementation of that on the ASP.NET server side. Now you can write all of that implementation yourself. It's not a very difficult thing to write, but there's already a library that does that for you, and that's called, I think, ASP.NET.WebApi.Cors or something. Let me show you how to implement that. Just go to the package manager. And this is the one, Microsoft.ASP.NET.WebApi.Cors. You want to install this one, the latest version of this one. Okay, this is done. To implement this, I'll go to the Web API configs register method. At the end of registering these routes and everything, I'm going to enable CORS in my application. In this library, there's a class called enable CORS attribute. So I'll just make an instance of that. The first parameter is which origins do you want to allow? At this time, let's say I want to allow requests from my website, which is at 8088. That's all I want to allow requests from. No other domain would be able to send requests to this API. Great. It says what headers do you want to allow? I'll say it doesn't matter what headers this domain sends me. That's fine. Let them send all kinds of headers. I will allow all of them. What methods do I want to allow? I want to allow all methods from this domain. And then you add this attribute to the HTTP context or the HTTP environment. And the way to do that is, I'll say config.enable CORS, and I'll supply to it this enable CORS attribute. This enable CORS attribute class implements this interface called iCORS policy provider. So I'll supply this to this guy, and that should actually do it. Let's see. And this is our website. I'll open the console. I'll reload the network tab just to see all the requests we make. And I'll call the show API counter. Before I click this button, remember I have whitelisted this website to be able to call the API. So we should not get the error message that we were getting over here earlier. We should see the counter. We should see the latest counter incremented by 1. Before that, let's go and check the file as to what the latest counter is. It is 8. So we should see it gets called, and we see the number 9. The network tab tells us you made a successful post request and the response was 9, and this time the console doesn't display that warning that says the API disallows requests from this host. So you might think, super, now I got everything nailed down. Now my website and my API is completely secure. They're talking to each other fine. Nobody else can make a request to this API. False. I'm going to demonstrate how vulnerable your API still is, both to browser clients and to non-browser clients. First, let me just write a simple non-browser client, a console app. I'll create a new console app. I'll call it console app 1. I'll make a post request to this API endpoint and run this code. It hits my API and it returns a successful result. And my client, which is a non-browser client, is not restricted. So even if you've implemented the same origin policy on your servers, you're not completely protected from any kind of access. Let's see if we're protected in the browser itself. So I'll go back to my website. I just implemented CORS, right? And I saw that it was allowing my localhost because I had whitelisted it. This time, let's go back to the API code and let's disallow our website from accessing the API. I'll go here, I'll change the port number, or I could completely change this to something else. I'll change it to my own website. So it's allowed from my website, but you're not allowed to call this API from this local website that we have. Does this actually work? Let's see. I'll look at the console. I'll enable network requests to be shown and look at the console. If I click the button this time, even though our website was disallowed from making requests to our API, and our API apparently did implement the enable CORS library, you're still getting this request from a blacklisted client. Does it go through successfully? Of course, once it has entered the action, it will go through successfully. So you're still screwed if you do this much of implementation, which is what all tutorials will tell you. First of all, there are hardly any tutorials, and whatever there are will tell you this is how you implement it, and if this is how you've done it, you're screwed. Your website is still vulnerable. Even though you'll get an error here, and this policy, this message or warning over here kind of indicates that you were not able to call the API. You just saw that you actually were able to call the API, and you can check that again by going to the network tab and seeing that you actually did get a 200 status code with a proper response that incremented the counter. And remember that post action is simply a standalone, a placeholder for what could be a very important business function of yours that you want protected. So you're still screwed from every angle. Your console app is calling you left, right, center. Your browser, even though it's pretending not to be able to call you, it's actually calling you, and you don't know how many fake entries you have in your database, even if you've implemented CORS this way. So this is the first bug or a kind of lacune or a shortcoming in the way the library is implemented. I will talk about I'll go into the internals of the code of the library and show you where the error is and also show you a bug fix. But for now, let's focus on what the actual errors are. Also notice the browser did not send an options method. You might be thinking, where's the options method? Well, don't worry about that. The browser does send the options method. It kind of has some algorithm to determine if this request is a simple request or is actually something that needs a pre-flight request. And that algorithm is internal to the browser, but be rest assured that that's not a problem over here. But if you explicitly want to make sure that every time the browser should send an options method, then one way to fake that is to on the server is to expect a custom header, and from the client you send that custom header, then the browser will first make an options pre-flight request. Here's how you do it. Let's add a custom header to the API and allow that header from this domain. I'll go back and allow that from my local host, port 8088, and I will say that I'm allowing this custom, let's call this ping pong. This header is called ping pong, x ping pong, and my local host is now a whitelisted domain. I will restart the API. I'll go to the website code, and this time I will add a header to this request. This was called x ping pong, and I'll put any value, eta ping, eta pong. I can put anything over here. I can't think of anything sensible. This should force the browser to send an options request header, an options HTTP method. Let's click the button, and we see that our API was hit. But if I go and check the network tab, it first sent an options. In the options header or in the options method, the client rightly asked, can I send you this X ping pong, and can I send you this post request, if my origin is this, and the server said, sure, you have my blessing. Here is the X ping pong. You can send me that one. You can also, this is sure, very happy to have this origin. Thank you, welcome. And so this browser then made a post request, and that post request sent a proper response. So the problem with this implementation of this CORS library is, regardless of whether a custom header is sent or not, the API, the library, should disallow any calls to the API from any domains other than those whitelisted, which it doesn't do. In the next segment of the series, I'll show you where the problem is in the source code of this library. And in the following video, I'll show you how to fix it.
Jaya means victory. Hail, hallelujah. And Bhagavan is the living presence within us. The love that lives within us is who we really are. When we sing Jaya Bhagawan, we sing victory to our own hearts. May that love conquer all the darkness. Let's sing this together. Jaya Bhagawan, 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 Jaya